Good afternoon. I'm Larry Mantle of Pasadena's own KPCC 89.3 FM. Thanks. Thank you. And that's how I feel about KPCC, and it's great to work for a place that you feel such a connection to because it is a mission-driven organization, one where we really buy into the idea of civil conversation, taking the most contentious, most difficult issues, and trying to find ways for people to respectfully talk their way through those challenges. Well, I'm really looking forward to our program this afternoon. It's an honor to join with these 6 leaders of higher education and premier cultural institutions to talk about the toughest challenges we face and how we talk about those in ways that move us forward and keep us from screaming at each other and getting locked into our intractable positions. These giants of higher education and culture in Pasadena are local figures, but all of them are truly national and international figures as well. And we are incredibly fortunate in this community to be able to bring them together for a conversation like this. And first, I want to thank them for the willingness with their schedules to take the time to do this. It's an honor to be part of it. I'd like to think that public radio is generally a bastion of civility in an increasingly angry media world. However, even we have to deal with the blind passion and the fear that fuels the trend of public hostility that we'll be talking about today. It's become so much a part of life that to ignore the rancor is to miss one of the most important trends in our country. Though most of our listeners are open-minded, curious about the world, there are others who are deeply frightened with what's going on, and they cling to a kind of fundamentalism, a closed-off worldview. For them, this time period is extremely frightening. I think for some of our listeners, they feel powerless, overwhelmed by the pace and complexity of current events. So it's easier to see the world as broken down into people that wear black hats and people that wear white hats. It explains things. It gives a context for what goes on in the world. And that kind of a narrative, as clear-cut, as simple, as in a box as it is just so ripe for news media that they can't help but pick it up and run with it and give people exactly what they want. But if only life were that simple. It isn't. We can't put everybody in a black hat and a white hat and say that this defines who they are as moral or good or virtuous people. So over the next couple of hours, we're going to be wrestling with this issue of civility in public life, how we talk honestly with argument and with emotion while hearing and considering what those with strongly different opinions have to say. With that in mind, I'm looking to challenge our panelists to vehemently disagree with each other while modeling that civility. They're good at the civility part, I'm sure. You don't get a job as a college president or the head of the Huntington by being a contentious, difficult person. But I'm hoping that they will let that passion out today and feel free to really model that strong disagreement in a respectful and open way. It's appropriate we begin our program this afternoon with probably the most civil man that I know in public service. His patience and careful consideration are remarkable, as is his positive way of addressing very tough civic challenges. He was the first guest I ever interviewed just over 27 years ago on my daily program, Air Talk. He held the same position then as now, though the job has changed quite a bit, and the way a mayor is elected is different today than then. He is a behavioral role model for me, the mayor of Pasadena, Bill Bogart.
I was prepared to say thank you to Larry for a nice introduction, but his introduction today goes beyond the pale. From that time that he interviewed me on the opening session of his program, and today, I did take 14 years off and served as a private citizen. and then circumstances that were totally unexpected by me and perhaps by almost anyone else have resulted in my being back in the office of mayor of a great city. Proud to do so and truly grateful for the opportunity to work with all of you, the people who are here, and particularly the panelists who have such a strong commitment to the well-being of our city. As you know from the invitation, this event is termed, quote, Honoring Civility for a Civil Society, a forum organized by Pasadena's higher education community, inspired by Pasadena City of Learning. That's a pretty heavy load, and I thought I might just take a moment to offer some preliminary comments. First, civility. That's a subject that is frequently talked about these days, but rarely analyzed. The opportunity that we have today is to see some analysis of the role of civility in our society, where it's been, where it is, and where it might be in the future. All of us are aware of the institutions that make up Pasadena's higher education community, which adds so much depth and prestige to our city. The presidents of these institutions are the participants in this forum, and they will surely provide insightful and interesting comments. Incidentally, this might be the first time that all 6 of these institutions have joined together through their presidents to analyze a topic of great importance. So this is a landmark. I want to express once again gratitude to the presidents who are here and who are willing to participate in this way. As to Pasadena City of Learning, the awareness among the general public, I would say, is much less extensive. And a brief description of PCOL might be in order. PCOL is a series of meetings, not an organization, that began more than 10 years ago. These meetings bring together representatives of the institutions with us today and many other organizations in this city that are all committed to educating, to informing, and to promoting lifelong learning. The purpose of the meetings is to share information, to communicate about current projects, programs, and activities, and to promote coordination and collaboration among the participants. This forum is an example, perhaps one of the best examples, of the kind of collaboration that has been achieved. There might be another time to talk in greater detail about PCOL, and I would look forward to that opportunity. The forum today can be described as considering 2 basic questions. Are we at risk of losing basic civility in modern society? And can we risk losing our civility without falling into total chaos as a society? Based on current events, public discourse, and the media, the answer to the first question seems to be yes. The slightest hint of disagreement with another can today be met with serious threats. Candidates for office superimpose rifle targets over the faces of opponents and send them out to mass audiences on the internet. Reality shows promote and encourage crass behavior, lack of manners, and argument for the sake of argument. Indeed, propriety may well be considered a virtue that is out of date and a sign of weakness. Rudeness now seems to be the new normal. Part of the problem lies with the lost art of civil discourse. Many of our political leaders simply cannot engage in productive discussion. Efforts to reach across the aisle and find common ground are infrequent. This, in turn, spills over into our own daily discourse. Lively discussions about current events and issues too often devolve into angry sarcasm, name-calling, and personal attacks on anyone who dares to disagree. So the next question is, what is the impact of losing our civility? Do not the values of free speech, the right to agree to disagree, and the protection of individual freedoms still represent the ideals upon which our nation is based. Why is it then that we seem so quickly inclined to disregard those important core values? Our speakers today are prepared to address these questions, and I expect that they will send us away with provocative new insights and renewed commitment to the core values of a civil society. It is my privilege to introduce the keynote speaker, author and president of Fuller Theological Seminary, Richard J. Mao. He has served as Fuller president since 1993. He earned a master's degree in philosophy at the University of Alberta, and his PhD in philosophy is from the University of Chicago. Richard has an impressive record of publication. He is the author of 17 books, including The God Who Commands, The Smell of Sawdust, He Shines in All That's Fair, Culture and Common Grace, Calvinism in the Las Vegas Airport. I intended to ask him about that. And an expanded and revised edition of Uncommon Decency, Christian Civility in an Uncivil World. His most recent book is Abraham Kuyper, A Short and Personal Introduction. Our speaker has also participated in many councils and boards, and he currently serves as president of the Association of Theological Schools. He is a leader for interfaith theological conversations, particularly with Mormons and Jewish groups. In 2007, Princeton Theological Seminary awarded Dr. Mao the Abraham Kuyper Prize for Excellence in Reformed Theology and Public Life. It is indeed a pleasure for me to invite Dr. Richard Mao, president of one of the world's largest Christian seminaries, to step forward to offer his views on honoring civility for a civil society. Dr. Mao.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'm just greatly honored and personally delighted to be here with my presidential colleagues to explore together these important issues. I wrote my book on civility back in right around early 1990s, and in the last couple of years, people have said to me, you wrote that book too early. We need it more today than we needed it then. And I became very much aware of that when I was visiting a congressional office of a conservative Republican with whom I had established a friendship and a kind of a friendly debating team, and walked into his office as prearranged, and I had some things I wanted to talk to him about, but he said, "Today I want to talk about Congress." He said, you live out there on the West Coast. How do you view us here in Congress these days? And I said, well, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. You folks look awful. And he said, it's even worse than you think. He said, I've been in Congress for a couple of decades, and we used to be able to talk to each other. He said, we would debate, have very passionate debates. We would disagree about things. But we used to be able, afterward, to play a round of golf or meet in the cloakroom or have lunch together and talk things over. Then he referred back to the days when Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would get together and forge compromises after having publicly disagreed about things. And I thought, maybe I ought to revise that book. And then my publisher called and said, we've been thinking we need a new edition of that. And so I went back and read what I'd written some almost two decades earlier. And when I first started thinking about civility, I was very much motivated by or inspired by a wonderful line from the University of Chicago historian, theologian, Dr. Martin Marty, who in one of his books said this. He said, people today who are civil often don't have very strong convictions, and people who have strong convictions often aren't very civil. And what we need is convicted civility. That is the willingness to deeply believe in things and yet at the same time engage in friendly discussion with people with whom we strongly disagree. And as a person of faith, back in the early 1990s, I thought immediately of the ways in which religion is often a part of the problem, religious convictions. In those days, Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, Christians and Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina and other parts of Eastern Europe, Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, and those are the things I had in mind. I wrote my book. And within 2 weeks of publishing my book, I got 2 separate calls for interviews, one from the Boston Globe, the other from the New York Times. They obviously hadn't read my book, but they were looking for somebody who had written something about civility. And in each case, they wanted to talk about freeways in California. They wanted to talk about parking lots. They wanted to talk about aisles in supermarkets. They were getting down to the kind of incivilities that Larry was talking about earlier, and it is the incivilities of a lot of reality shows and a lot of cable news, and those of us who write for online websites. Very often the remarks, the comments that come in are very abusive, a fundamental incivility in our society today. And I do think we are in a crisis. And I'm so pleased that we can talk together here because, as the mayor rightly noted, we do have a wonderful group of influential institutions of higher education in Pasadena. It's a great education city. And I hope that we can find ways to contribute together to promoting civility, not only within the academy, and we've got a lot of that to do before we start telling other people how to get along, the kinds of debates that we have within the academy, on our campuses about science and faith, sexuality, curriculum, the use of new technologies, and in spreading the word about our programs, budgeting priorities, and all the rest. We have our own problems, but also to think together about how we as a community of educators can more effectively address the questions of civil society, which desperately need educators along with others, leaders in civil society, to be addressing these issues. Let me say something about civility. The word civility comes from the word civitas, which means city. To be civil is to know how to get along in the city. We get this idea, this theme, from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who said, the earliest stage where we learn how to bond with other people, where we learn how to feel good about other people, that earliest stage is kinship. It's the child and the parent, the brother and the sister, grandparents, extended family. But it's in kinship that we really learn how to bond with other people. And then the next stage, he said, was the stage of friendship, where we take those same feelings of intimacy, the same feelings of bonding, and we go beyond blood relationships to people who are like us and whom we like, and we form those kinds of bonds with them. But Aristotle says we don't truly develop the proper adult virtues until we learn how to get along in the public square. And we have to imagine the public square in the ancient Greek city-state, where there were people from other tribes, other nations, people who spoke different languages, people of different ethnicities and races. And he says, in encountering the other, in encountering the stranger, and being able, in some sense, to take what we learned in kinship and what we learned in friendship and apply that to other people simply because they're human. Simply because we share a common human nature. When we learn how to do that, we've learned how to be virtuous adult human beings. And so the city, the public square, the pluralism and diversity of our life together in civil society, political society, is an important arena for exhibiting those virtues that are associated with civility. And I think we educators need to address that. What is it that we can do? Because in many ways, education basically picks up at the point where people have learned the lessons from kinship and from friendship. But we can be a very important vehicle and provide a very important arena for developing those virtuous traits that make for civility in the larger society. And you know, when we think about that Aristotelian sequence of family, kinship, friendship, and then the public square, I think we can identify some of the problems that we have today, because we're really seeing much of the failure in the family to cultivate that politeness. You know, I think a lot about the family meal. You know, the family meal is the first place where we learn to stay at the table for 45 minutes with people that we're really irritated about. You know. And I can't stress the importance of meals and civility in that regard. When I became the provost at Fuller Theological Seminary, I went to a conference on food services in higher education. There were people there from the Marriott chain who in those days were doing quite a bit of campus food services. And one of them gave a talk that was very illuminating for me. He said, you know, we have reorganized the way in which people get together to eat on campuses, moving from dining to grazing. You know, many of us, when we were in college in our younger days, we actually sat at a table with other people, were served a meal, and we did not always sit with the same people, and we learned the stories. We learned how to interact with different people from different backgrounds, studying in different areas, preparing for different professions. But the Marriott people said, you know, these days, the design of a typical eating area on a university or college campus is that of a series of grazing stations. I was on a college campus recently, and they took me into what they called the dining hall. But you walk in and you go to the salad bar. You get your salad, you go back and maybe sit with a few people while you're eating your salad. Then you get up and you go to either the sandwich place or the hot meal place. And you may go back for seconds, and you may actually sit at 2 or 3 or 4 different tables. And then dessert is typically grabbing the yogurt cone on the way out at the yogurt machine, and you're actually walking out of the cafeteria while you're eating your dessert. And there's very little interaction there. And in many ways, and the Marriott people said this too, this grazing pattern is typical of family today. And it's not necessarily an intentional defect, but we're grandparents and we hear about this, Phyllis and I. Soccer games, concerts, music lessons, church activities, very much on the run. And I think our son and daughter-in-law do a pretty good job of maintaining the family meal, but it's so easy for the home to become a series of grazing stations and moments of grazing. And I think one of the things that we can do as educators is to think about ways in which we can get people to sit and talk to each other. Sometimes we may have to offer free meals or something else in order to do it, but we need to find ways. And in each of our institutions, including the Huntington Library, people come from very different backgrounds. In our case, and a number of other cases, very different nations, different tribal and racial and ethnic backgrounds, different religious perspectives. And we need to see ourselves as, among other things, workshops in civility, training for being city folks, learning how to interact with each other. in the public square. And I think it's an important challenge for us even to think together. How can we educate for civility? And what are the conditions in our culture that we can address as educators, as political leaders in the city, as people from a variety of religious and other social agencies and other areas of service, businesses and the like? How can we in this city promote civility? Frankly, I'm going to say I think the Tournament of Roses is a very civil event. I think the spirit of that. There are times I wish we could package that and find ways where people from very different backgrounds are joining together and enjoying some of the same things. And I think Pasadena does a pretty good job of that in a number of ways. But I think we could be more intentional about the civility dimension of our participation and the way in which we design and structure public space and the events in our public space. And I also want to say that the more I have thought about this, the more I see this as a genuine challenge in moral and, I want to say, spiritual formation. There's a need to cultivate the kind of humility. It's one thing to have strong convictions. It's another thing to simply refuse to listen to other people. To ask them what they believe. I happened to be invited several years ago now to speak in the Mormon Tabernacle to a large group of packed house of Mormons and some other people representing other faiths. And I said, as an evangelical Christian, I want to apologize to the Mormon community. We've often told you what you believe rather than ask you what you believe. I got hate mail yesterday about that. I'm still getting that, And it just seems like such a simple point to make. That if you really care about the truth, if you really care about defending the truth, ask people rather than running the risk of distorting what they believe. We just had earlier today a wonderful Jewish-Christian dialogue event where we learned so much from each other. And that posture of learning and the humility. I'll do one little sermon piece here. Psalm 139, one of my favorite psalms. The psalmist at one point says, Lord, I hate your enemies with a perfect hatred. That sounds very arrogant. Lord, you and I are on the same side. And then it's as if he stops and he says, oops. And then the next verse says, search me and know my thoughts and see if there be any wicked way in me. And whether we're religious or not, I think we need to think about what's going on in me and what do I need to learn in that posture of humility. I'll close with a personal example. The time that I felt pretty good about myself on the civility thing, I was going into a Bonds parking lot, and I saw a parking space, pretty crowded lot, and I saw it, and I pulled in, and horns started blowing, and it was clear somebody was really upset, and I turned, and she was upset with me, the driver, and she gave me the middle finger and shook her fist and obviously yelling some things at me that I couldn't hear. She was clearly, and I realized that I had taken the space that she had been waiting for. And she drove away fast, but I got out of the car and I noticed she parked on the other side of the lot, in a more distant spot. So I went over and she was just getting out of the car, and I said, ma'am, I just want to tell you, I'm the guy who you got so upset with, and I don't blame you. I didn't know you were waiting for that slot, and I took it without thinking, and I just want to tell you I'm sorry. And she said, I don't have time for this. She started to cry. She said, if you just knew the kind of day that I've had. And she turned around and stomped away, and then she stopped. She just turned around with tears streaming down her face. She said, thank you. And I felt really good about myself. 2 weeks later, I returned a Hertz rental car at an airport, and I just made it in 2 minutes before the deadline where I would have to pay that high extra fee. And the attendant who was checking the other car and just stood talking to the guy, and I went over the 2 minutes. And he came, and I was a minute over. And he said, you're going to have to pay the extra hour. And I said, no, I was here. You saw me here. No, said, I'm sorry, sir. I got to go. What's written there? And I said, well, I'm going to complain about this. I'm not going to pay it. And I got really angry with him. And his supervisor came over, obviously aware of some kind of turmoil in the lot. middle-aged African-American woman, walked over and she said to us, "What's going on here?" And he said, "This guy doesn't want to pay the extra hour, and I checked him in late." And I said, "Yeah, but he was talking to the guy up front." And he said, "Just a minute, hold it." She said to her employee, "Go away, I'll take care of this." He handed her the sheet, walked away, and she looked at it, and she said, "You don't have to pay, it's okay." And I said, "Well, of course I don't have to pay." And she said, "Honey, you need a hug." And she hugged me. And a lot like the woman in the other parking lot, I said, "Thank you." And I think we need more hugs in parking lots. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mel. A lot to consider, and I'm sure much that we can follow up with in the course of our conversation with our panelists this afternoon. Well, let me get to the introductions of our panelists who'll be up here on the dais today. First, when he arrived as president of Art Center College of Design, our first panelist walked onto an uncertain campus. The previous year, the college had faced particularly tough times, with many students and faculty members turning on the previous president over his plans for a Frank Gehry-designed campus expansion. As the new president arrived in October of 2009, I'm sure all his words and actions were being very closely scrutinized to determine what his priorities would be: facilities expansion, improving the current buildings, slowing down rising tuition. That doesn't even take into account the run-of-the-mill campus politics all of our panelists know all too well. I'm sure that he'll have a lot to say about Civility. The president of Art Center College of Design, Lorne Buckman. He is only the 8th president in his school's history. It's the intellectual, scientific, and engineering powerhouse known around the world, perhaps even in space, thanks to JPL's missions. The California Institute of Technology. Our next panelist arrived at Caltech in 2006 to lead an institution that's still proudly intimate for students, but with a massive footprint in academe, science, and the space program. Perhaps one of Caltech's biggest challenges isn't in providing a superb education for the gifted student, but in balancing the whole person at Caltech, given its intense academic demands in cutting-edge science. Joining us, the president of Caltech, Jean-Loup Chemot. It's an institution that, as far as I know, is completely unique. A combination art museum, botanical gardens, and historical research center and archives. We know it casually as the Huntington, a place that not only enjoys the loyalty of the thousands each year who visit, but of a staff that seems particularly proud and appreciative of working in such a beautiful setting. Like so many other institutions, likely everyone that's represented here today, the Huntington recently faced its own financial challenges in operating its huge facility, paying its full staff. From what I've heard, the Huntington's president is being given high marks for his handling of that challenge, which is a very tough thing, trying to serve a vast outside public and the people that work so hard, so diligently for the mission of your institution. The president of the Huntington Library, Art Collections, and Botanical Gardens, Stephen Koblich. Our next panelist is the newest to his position, taking the helm of Pacific Oaks College just this year. He presides over an institution that's undergone big change in the past couple of years. Pacific Oaks is now part of a network of TCS Educational System, a nonprofit that includes organizations across the country. However, it is still locally based, devoted to the Quaker values of peace and tolerance, and educating students for work in education and related fields. The student population is over 90% female, and the average age of the student at Pacific Oaks is 39, distinctly different makeup than other schools in our area. He's previously the provost of Nichols College in Massachusetts, CEO of the firm Education Advisory Group, now the president of Pacific Oaks College, Ezat Parnia. Finally, the president of our largest local institution, and one that is very, very close to my heart, Pasadena City College. I worked at PCC for nearly 20 years, and even though we have beautiful studios at KPCC on South Raymond, I still miss the college. There is no place, as far as I'm concerned, like it. I assume even with all the challenges financially that it faces, it's still a remarkable place. Community colleges, as you all know, facing huge budget cuts, and demand for student enrollment is through the roof, as you typically see with an economic downturn. Huge challenge running a community college today. Everything you and your board try to do to balance the budget and limit cuts is going to be criticized. You just know that going in. You'll constantly be accused of disdaining input, but at the same time, so hard to get practical solutions to the challenges that you face from the very people who are telling you what a terrible job you're doing in trying to solve the problem. I've heard politics on that campus can be also a little bit interesting. Just someone's told me about that. He arrived at PCC from West Los Angeles College in mid-2010. The president of Pasadena City College, Mark Rota. Gentlemen, I'm counting on you to really sink your teeth into this. I know that you work in an environment where anything you say during a recorded event like this could be used against you, taken out of context to show how insensitive you are, how misguided, your priorities all wrong. So we know that going in. But it'll be my intent to push you nonetheless to say things that really express how you feel about this and to take on the challenges you're facing on your campus. The audience is laughing, but I trust you're really gonna do this. Let me begin, first of all, by getting a quick response to what we heard in our keynote address, your response to the comments from a man who comes from his own personal faith as well as his study of human nature. Let me begin with you, Dr. Buckman, your response to what we just heard.
I think he's right, actually. Fundamentally, it's interesting to me that the whole issue of difference and our capacity as a culture and as a society to accommodate difference is the most pressing problem we have. We arguably have gone from a 20th century that was preoccupied with issues of ideology to a kind of politics of identity today. And it's interesting to me that the fear of the stranger, that the issue of kind of facing what we don't know, the other and the threat that the other contains toward us as human beings, seems to be a trigger for us to come forward and lose a kind of basic willingness to engage in a civil way. That incivility is somehow a part of fear, it's a part of threat, it's a part of struggling with somehow acknowledging or asserting a superiority over another. And ultimately, I actually think that it's wonderful that educational institutions are coming together here, because I don't know of a better path to human dignity. I don't know of a better way to wrestle with the issue of identity than through education. And I would say particularly that education and the world of higher education is a place where identity can be wrestled with, where we can understand the problems and the situations that plague us in our fear of the stranger, and that particularly, it won't surprise you, art and design education that fundamentally honors the imagination, that is about collaboration, that is about saying something and looking at it in a way that's never been seen before, which arguably is the greatest and most sacred task of the artist, I would say within that environment, we can really begin to wrestle with that issue.
I'd even say, you know, at your institution, because I've seen your student body, incredibly diverse. You have students from around the world. And part of what you're encouraging them to do, of course, is to take risks, to put themselves out there, to potentially endure ridicule, harsh critique, and so to try and build their resiliency, to be able to hear that, to be able to do that, and to not be so devastated or to lash out against that, but to be able to work collaboratively is a huge thing. I want to talk more about that as we continue.
Okay.
All right, do you want to just add something?
I was going to say that the balance is that, you know, I like to think we teach people courage. That's what we're doing. We're teaching them the courage of their conviction, and to be, through the artistic process and through the design process, to have the courage to be able to say what they need to say, to solve the problems that they need to solve. But they're also a disruptive force in our culture, too. Artists need to tell us things that we're not comfortable hearing. And so it's an interesting balance of giving them the courage to do it, but understanding that there's a way of communicating and creating a balance. That's very important.
And encouraging artists to listen as well. That just because you're an artist doesn't mean that you have some platform where you're not immune to having to engage your critics.
And teaching them compassion and empathy and listening is crucial to them, to their thriving and to being great artists and designers.
Dr. Shemo, your response to Dr. Mao's keynote.
First, being a French origin, I like the part about dining. and I do agree with you that at the level of the family unit, it is a lost art, and I think which is something we should pay attention to. Maybe it has to do with the quality of the food too, but that's so I think it is. It was. I know you were trying to be a bit facetious, but I think it was an important point. If being civil starts at learning it at home or within your family. One point I will somewhat disagree with you, so we're allowed to disagree.
Yes, you're encouraged.
Is that you, and, unless I misunderstood you try to imply a belief that part of the issue has to do with the level of education, and maybe people are there is a recurring theme that we believe that the education level is declining in a country, and I'm not sure it is really education per se. To a large level, our political figures are educated or are supposed to be educated, but maybe more related to less interest in learning, and you see it especially in political figures. I think they're educated, but they don't want to learn new things. They're afraid of new things, and so there is maybe a slight. I'm not saying I disagree with you, but there's a slight different view of the question. A couple of points I would like to add to what you said, and one, since we go from art to engineering and science and technology here, one which relates to technology. I think I do believe that we may be more civil than we give ourselves credit for. We have an issue, I think, which is to be over-connected. We live in a world where there is a hyper-connection. Whatever is being said at a given time goes over the world in a matter of seconds. And because of that, what is more exciting is not to have two people who agree, but two people who disagree and are sometimes are fighting over an issue. So the lack of civility that you see in performance among political figures and so on is being amplified to an extreme level. That's the only thing people pay attention to, because it goes very quickly. And the other point I would like to make, I think it is critical I believe, for us to be more civil as a nation, because if we are not more civil as a nation, how do we expect to get along and work with other nations in the world? And I think it's a point that you try to make, but I would like to...
What do you mean by that, more civil as a nation?
More civil as a nation means to have what was described, a level of discourse, of discussion, to be able to argue with each other, but do it in a way that is that is constructive, that allow people to agree to disagree, and to build consensus in some way, which we seem to have been losing, especially at the level of the nation, at the level of the political.
So the American people, yeah. All right. Very good. Let's see, Dr. Koplik, your take on this.
I really wanted to put on a hat as a historian for a second and look at Rich's comments in that context. And I want to contrast the story he told about meeting his this congressman friend and the friend saying the things are worse than you think, and then to talk briefly about there's a fundamental incivility in our society, which is what Rich also reflected on. Unfortunately, historians have this nasty way of actually looking at things. And so when you talk, it may be worse than we think at the national level, but I want to remind everyone that this country was conceived in extraordinary violence, in which, among other things, at least two of the founding fathers had a duel with each other about something silly. And
are you suggesting we return to that to resolve that?
Well, I just wanted to point out that there are periods when Congress has been much rougher. Fist fights, knifings, etc. were not unusual in the 19th century. We had something called the Civil War that killed an extraordinarily high percentage of the people living in this country to free some of our fellow citizens. And certainly civility in the 20th century in the House has not always been the case. So I start out with that observation, which I know you know. The other thing is, and it to some extent I think goes along with what John Liu was talking about, I'm not convinced that there's a fundamental incivility in this country. I do think, as Larry said in the introduction, there's an enormous amount of fear in the country. It's a very, very difficult time. We've come through a period, and I'm now really thinking about the Second World War, the Civil Rights Movement, and then really, frankly, the decline of the family, which, as you, I think, correctly pointed out, has been such a central part of how people learn how to interact with each other. But we know the numbers, the statistics related to that. What always strikes me, and I'm not a foreigner, but I've lived a lot abroad, and I miss being in California in particular when I'm abroad, because we are so different, and it's the difference which makes California so exciting. And I think all of us know that when we walk down the street, we're going to interact with people who are not the same as us. And at least for me, that gives my life meaning, and I always rush back here as soon as I can. So, and I think a lot of people feel that way. What we're having is a difficulty with public discourse. And I think the public discourse the difficulties there are a product of a whole bunch of things, that some of which I thought Larry was getting at and we can return to.
All right, Dr. Koplik, thank you. Dr. Parnia.
Well, I'd like to agree with Richard about that we are in a crisis, and also agree with Steve that in fact we have had a more past violence among our politicians in Washington, D.C. But it wasn't a time that if somebody said something, it was transmitted around the world, and most of that remained in Washington. When Representative Joe Wilson screamed, "You lie," to President Obama in 2009, I think that was transmitted all over the world and, of course, to the children of this country. And I feel that the politicians in Washington, D.C. are setting a very bad example for the rest of us in terms of what we need to do in terms of civility. And I really feel that there's more can be done among the politicians. Right now, the rating in terms of Congress, it's at 7% in terms of approval rating, and almost 98% of the Congress get elected every year. So we have a work to do, in terms of citizens and for them to be informed so they can do a better job. And of course, the education plays a very important role in that direction. So we have a lot of work to do. And of course, we were talking earlier in terms of K through 12 and how much education happens there, that in fact it has gone backward in many ways. So, and that's where the civility starts, by the way, among the children and of course in the home and all that. And I have some stats that I'll share with you in terms of TV and the amount of information nowadays that the kids are exposed to. And it's all about incivility rather than civility.
All right. And Dr. Parney, you're mentioning the 7% approval rating for Congress. Remember, there is a margin of error. I'm highly skeptical it's as high as 7. That could be as low as 4%. So just not to split hairs. Dr. Rocha, your response to Dr. Mao, as well as your other panelists to this point.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. First of all, I'm very grateful for Dr. Mao's book, which I did read. And, I thought I'm from the public side here and among my colleagues. And I know I have the distinction of being the only one of us who appeared on the front page of the Star News in front of a student protest on the administration steps. And so I had an opportunity to practice some civility there, because you have just a whole bunch of students saying, I can't get my classes, and they're yelling at you and calling your names and so on. And so it was a real test. And a couple of things came to mind. One, the phrase from the Bible, "A soft answer turneth away wrath." And I tried to focus on that as a mantra as I was listening. And then as I was, kind of moving through that, I think the other thing that kind of tied into that I read in your book, Richard, was this wonderful idea that God is a slow God. God is slow. And so, I've been really struck by the ideas here about how important civility rests in terms of really the almost not raising your voice, the softness of one's voice, patience, and those kinds of ethical values. I would say, as a sidebar to that event on campus, I learned a great deal, and that the one way, I found a way to speak civilly to my faculty union president, because both of us appeared on Larry's show. It was the most civil conversation that we've had, and it shows you that there's a number of pathways. Last thing I want to say, just from the public side of the street, and I'll call this the parable of the 10 blankets. I do agree with Steve that I think that certainly there is, I'm an English teacher by trade, certainly the coarseness of our discourse, the level of screaming and hollering. I mean, we just have to be role models for changing that. But at the same time, I have to say that the community that I'm in is quite civil. I see public servants all around me. I see some of my colleagues here. And it is, for the great part, I'm amazed at how civil it is. Because, my parable of the 10 blankets is things are getting really rough right now. Because, a few years ago or 10 years ago or whenever the money was good, there were 10 of us, let's say, in a room, and all of us, had beds, and each one of us had a blanket, okay? And we slept comfortably at night, all right? Everything, got good night's sleep and so on. And then the state showed up and said, okay, we only have 8 blankets now, okay? And so those of us who are charged with leadership, then it starts, to get into a discussion and say, well, who doesn't get the blankets? And I think a lot of the discussion that is really strenuous and strained and so on comes from, the real issues, which are contentious. I mean, we're talking about, having to make priorities that we've never had to make before. And I'll leave it there and perhaps come back. There's a wonderful passage in Dr. Mao's book about leadership. And I think one of the things about how we really have to work on transformational leadership, and something that I fall short of the mark of, but that we need to fix on as a goal.
I want to take your point, Dr. Rocha, and kind of weave it in with some of the other things that are said. I think you're absolutely right that Today, public debates take on this very high-stakes nature to it, some of which is absolutely authentic that you're talking about. Fewer resources, people feeling like, in the case of PCC students, it's going to take me years to get through. I can't get classes. I can't afford to keep doing that, that kind of pressure that they feel. But I think there's even more than that. I think there is a feeling, because of this high fear level and anxiety that we've been talking about, where everything takes on ultimate stakes. There are kind of no low-level fires. Everything's an inferno, and everything has to be fought with all guns blazing. So how do we get some perspective on some of these, understanding there are some of these serious life and death or serious economic challenges, other things that are about people feeling disrespected that have more to do with ego than actually, real life differences, and people's own fears and insecurity. How do we address and get some perspective on things, first of all?
Yeah. Well, all I can say, and certainly there's more wisdom here, that I think the function of our leadership has to be to try and create a safe environment. The people on my campus, the students, are being injured. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to try and create an environment where that discussion can happen. I'd also say, just quickly, that part of civility and part of the answer to your question there has something to do with what I would call, generational generosity. That there's a sense that, and certainly our students feel, there's a sense that, well, hey, you guys got through and you guys got, public education and everything was good and so on, and now you're turning around and the money's tight and we're getting hit. That's a legit. I think
part of it's legitimate, but let me push back on that, because part of the other side of that is we have many more people going to college than we ever had going to college, and the percentage of people going to college has grown more than the percentage of the total population that pay taxes. So part of it, I understand they're feeling absolutely, it's like they got theirs, what I mean. The other is there's something real that has changed significantly in the intervening years. Part of this, I think, is looking at the totality of it. Doesn't invalidate the students' concerns or what it means to them individually, but it's a more complicated picture than just they got theirs, why can't I get mine?
Right. Well, I think for us, it's certainly a debate, right? One of the great debates in our culture, politically, public education, K-12, community colleges, and so on, is what is the nature of the public role? Are we going to, does the public have a role? And so I think one of the keys to civility is to recall historically the notion of Franklinian self-interest. We are so polarized now between the, cut your taxes kind of socialism scales of the debate, that we really need to go back to our own history and look at Benjamin Franklin's autobiography and his Enlightenment self-interest is that I have a book, Izat has a book, we each have one book. But if we put it into the middle and make a library, we now have two books.
All right.
And so
let's get some other folks here into the mix on this. I mean, I find it interesting. More people going to college than ever before. We have more college graduates. Colleges are supposed to be the place where we're challenged to think outside of our own biases, move away from just what our parents told us was reality, to analyze, to think, to process stuff. And yet, it seems, despite all these college graduates coming out, fundamentalist thinking is often prevailing. People falling into safe places, thinking down the line. You meet someone after 5 minutes, you know exactly where they're going to line up on all the issues, and individual thinking seems to have fallen by the wayside. How have we gotten to this point when higher education is exposed to more people than ever before?
If I can comment, and then I'll let join Mark. I think one of the reasons we see everything is kind of getting out of hand is because of the resources. There's a limited resources, and we have to do more with less. Now, that brings us to the notion of taxation. Are we willing to pay and educate our citizens and the workforce, or we rather just basically say no taxes, at the same time go and do it on your own? I think that's going to emerge in the months to come and years to come in terms of what's our willingness to invest in the future of the country.
And that's certainly, I mean, this fits, we're talking about on your campuses and higher education. But this trend toward incivility predates the economic downturn. It predates the huge cuts that you've had at your institutions. So clearly it's more than just the fact of economic crisis and fewer resources.
I think it's coincident with the internet, with increased travel, with the fact that, as Dr. Chameau said, things travel in an instant, and we are exposed to difference immediately now. And again, our own identity becomes threatened in that process, and it unleashes a kind of a violence. And I believe very strongly that conversation is the antidote.
Well, it's funny because we ridicule, our parents' and grandparents' generations for being emotionally locked up and not really letting out how they feel about things. And so all kinds of things that they do, the motivation is unclear because we didn't really know that. So now we live in this era where we say we want to know how people feel about things, not just what they think. But now it seems we don't know how to deal with those emotions because they make us mad or they're condemnatory or the emotions shut off debate. So is part of this learning how to be more open and deal with our feelings?
If we keep saying all those things, it becomes more and more depressing. Okay, so I tend to be relatively still optimistic, and I have faith in young people, and good food. And part of that too, and wine too. And I am, and my colleagues are in an environment where we do impact young people. So, given all those issues, I think we should try as leaders to focus on what we can do. I don't wake up every morning trying to solve the problems in Washington. I have limited influence on that. And I'll give you an example of what I view is important, at least we try to do at Caltech, is to make young people realize that collaboration it can be more important than competition. It's important to compete with yourself to be the best, but to collaborate, I think that's where the success will be. Try to help them to learn how to live and interact in a social environment. Coming back to the issues that we have at the family level, we have young people who come out of great families, but they have not learned how to live in a social environment. And we do things to try to help them do that. Other things we can do in not only the president, but people who are in leadership in universities, including the faculty, we have to show in our behavior that we are civil and we are setting an example. I always tell people, most important part of my job is to remain calm. Only, people don't come to my office people don't come to my office with with nice stories. When they come to my office because they have a problem. So, remaining calm, listening to people, communicating when times are tough, are the kinds of things that we can do. And I believe at each level, and at the level of a president or whatever position you have in your community, to try to achieve those goals, over time you have impact. So I still believe in
well, I think that makes absolute sense. The more people are able to work together and see each other as human, the better. I was just going to say, though, I think one of the problems is, and I think so many of us in our workplaces see this, people I work with are great, but most of them live in similar parts of town. Their friends hold similar views. They vacation in the same places. They read the same books. They read the same online publications. They read the same blogs. It is its own cocoon, and they drive the same cars. And so how do you give it? I mean, if we are wired as human beings to have in-group and out-group, that's just part of our survival mechanism, and our in-group is this tiny little in-group, then how do we feel safe enough to go outside of our cloistered environment and to make a much bigger in-group and people that are outside bring them in?
I'll come to that, but I want to start out by taking Mark's side versus your hard questioning. And you were pushing him about so many people graduating from college. It's a kind of an uninteresting statistic. Of course, more people are graduating from college. We live in an information-based society, and the jobs that the society produces needs a level of education that didn't need to occur 50 years ago. What you missed saying, which I think is much more germane, that 40 years ago, the United States had the highest percentage of adults who were educated in colleges and universities. Today, we're at the bottom of the second 10. As a matter of fact, we're being outcompeted by nations around the world who are investing money in education.
I thought the highest percentage of people, college graduates, we've ever had now. That's
right.
not true?
Yes, it is true, but it's also very low internationally. What's happened is that around the world, there has been an understanding that you need advanced education in order to compete. So the fact that people are going more to colleges is because they can't get jobs to sustain their families and their lives as adults without that education.
But my point is, if you're exposed to college, isn't college the place where you learn to take in outside things, not shut down to listen and interact?
Not necessarily. I would disagree with Lauren in terms of the wonderfulness of formal educational institutions.
College I went to, I sure was exposed to that, but you don't think that's the case?
I'm not going to ask what you were exposed to because I don't want to embarrass you. But I do want to point out that as Rich did, that colleges are not this remarkable place of learning. The cultural wars which have been involved in all of this are very much a product of the universities, in a positive sense, if you will. I'm like Jean-Loup, I have been trained to see the optimistic view of everything, otherwise we wouldn't have the jobs that we have. But I do want to point out that we need to have more college graduates, or at least better learning folk. And I liked Jean-Loup's notion about learning rather than education, because the jobs of tomorrow will demand that. And we don't have a learning culture in this society. As one of my colleagues said, I think it was Lauren, as we were talking about this, we have an entertainment culture. And that's not a learning culture. And so we're frankly getting out-competed because we're not producing what we need to produce in our educational systems to compete internationally. So and at the top, like most of the institutions here, we're doing very well. But it's the mass base. So the fact that we have more college graduates, from my perspective, is good, and we shouldn't close it off. So that leads to
I'm sorry, and I wasn't arguing fewer people should go to school. My point is, if they are going to school, civility is something that should come in the process. And you're saying that's not really...
I would take learning over civility, frankly, but that's my own.
You can't have both?
View.
Wait. Learning is... Yeah.
Well, it would be nice to have both, but I really want to get at this issue of priorities. Because to take Mark's question, the society, which I thought was the right question, if the society has a responsibility to ensure that most of our 18 to 30-year-olds have the opportunity for post-secondary education, and I think they do, I would argue that for the nature of a civil society, we need an educated public, then we need to educate the students, and the students become the priority.
But you're just saying that education doesn't correlate with civility.
I didn't think it necessarily does. But I said that the society needs educated people. And that doesn't guarantee they're going to be civil.
Right.
Okay? But you had, I thought, introduced this issue in a way that somehow that we have all these people in college and they're not civil. Well, going to college doesn't necessarily make you civil.
Should it?
Well, that's a very interesting question that lots of different colleges talk about. But frankly, most of us don't do much about it. So
you're all here, though. I mean, is this something that you should commit to as part of the mission of higher education?
It depends on, from my perspective, and I was a college president, as you know, it depends on what the other aspects of your mission is. And if I have to give a choice, if I have to choose between developing people's skills intellectually and developing their critical skills, I will leave civility to other institutions.
See, I'd say you can't be intellectually developed without civility, I would argue. I don't think it's possible.
May I interject for a second? I mean, one assumption you're making that every college and university in the United States attempts to educate students, become culture-based and understand the culture and therefore respect other cultures and other groups. That's not the reality of it. With the exception of some schools, for instance, community colleges and others, most of the institutions are operating very much in terms of dominant culture. I come from Northeast, and having been here for about 4 months, I'm just amazed about the diversity of Los Angeles and the culture of different cities and towns. This is the future of America. You know, when you go to Northeast, and I came from a school that was 95% white, and they have no understanding of what's going on around the country, and imagine they don't get any education whatsoever when it comes to intercultural understanding and values, and then we expect these students to graduate and go to the workplace and understand other cultures. So this is a fundamental problem in the higher education that we haven't really discussed and we don't want to address. And I think at some point it's going to come to head, because with the exception of some schools, and of course Pacific Coast College and Children's School happens to be a very diverse environment. You know, 98% women in terms of gender, but when it comes to diversity, almost 38% Latino, 10% African American. And we have the social justice and culture-based education and anti-bias education is the fundamentals of the mission of the institution. And I can tell you, you know, for the 4 months I've spent here, it's one of the most civil environments I've ever been. We have people from all walk of life, backgrounds, and culture, and they come to a classroom. And the way they learn, because of course they are in the real environment, you know, sometimes they have the fears, but it's the thought leaders and our faculty that make clear from the day one that they have to respect one another, and that basically carry back to their communities.
Let me ask you a question. If a student comes to Pacific Oaks and says, during the course of talking about education, the population of public schools, saying, I think illegal immigration is a terrible thing, I think it's decimated public schools, we need to send people back to Mexico who are here illegally. It takes a hard line, a very hard line on illegal immigration. At your school, is that person going to be turned on and shouted down? Or is there going to be a civil conversation after that person expresses it where people really engage on whether that's a rational, constructive argument?
Very good question. In fact, when I first came, I visited almost like 10 or 12 classes, and in every one of them, faculty create a very safe environment. Anybody with any kind of point of view, they can express themselves. But in the Pacific Coast College, that person will be able to hear the view of a person that is an immigrant and he has been here in this country and kind of trying to make a living. And therefore, they have a contact with that person right there and then, rather than stating something and then hearing it through the news or someone else. So it's that kind of interaction that really makes it civil. But the role of the faculty is very important in this, because they are managing the classroom, you know, and they have to balance this kind of point of views. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen in every academic setting. And because the faculty just not trained and they don't have the skills, if you will, and they don't have, and of course this is a very fearful thing, you know, bring up this kind of difference in the classroom. And if you're not trained, you're going to be very much in a disadvantage. So we are really facing some tough questions in higher education that we have to address and of course prepare the population for a country that's becoming more and more diverse, and you cannot roll it back. You know, 50 million now in this country are Latino population, right?
You know, I'd like to add that, and maybe to Steve's very civil disagreement with me about the quality and the power of college education. I just want to tell of my experience and what I see happening within Art Center College of Design, in which, you know, our students are wrestling with issues that are fundamentally transforming who they are as human beings. We have a program through an NGO status we have with the United Nations called Design Matters, in which our students are going to troubled corners of the world. They are going to Santiago, Chile. They're going to Peru. They're going to Kenya. They are working with communities, not from a privileged perch in Pasadena, but directly engaging with communities that have issues and problems of a very deep nature. And it's the creative imagination engaging with these communities that is producing solutions to, and real workable solutions to what it is they're doing. And you watch these students, they travel there, they engage, they have these communities that are absolutely falling in love with them with huge gratitude and appreciation. And they come back transformed as human beings. In my college education, I never had an experience like that. And I will say this about the millennials, at least those at Art Center. They may be looking for work, but they are fundamentally looking for meaningful work. Many of them deeply care about who they are in the culture, how they are contributing to that culture, the difference they are making. And it is education at Art Center anyway, that is giving them the opportunity to do that, to interact, to collaborate on teams. You have a graphic designer, and you have a photographer, and you have a filmmaker, and you have an advertiser, all coming together to really work from their various points of view to make something happen and to make change. That is transforming them. That is the beginning, I think, of the conversation, of the discourse that will allow for a society that maybe can reach the next level of civility.
That's great. That's very impressive. Let's talk about some terms, because I think a lot of the language that we use plays into a kind of polarization and lack of civility. Maybe you have your own. I certainly have my terms, and I see them on throughout the political spectrum. I mean, the whole idea that pro-life has come into the lexicon, meaning that if you're in favor of abortion rights, you're against life. Pro-abortion, for example. Mean-spirited, a term that we often hear. The left uses it frequently about people on the right, as though they hate poor people and that's the only reason why they would propose their particular political solutions. Even the term social justice, I would argue, is a polarizing term that shuts off debate, because it implies that if you don't hold to the same solutions, somehow you don't believe in justice for people. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Is part of the language that we use cutting off the chance to dialogue?
Yeah, I'm glad you used referred to the term social justice, and I absolutely think that the language that we're using is cutting us off from dialogue. Social justice itself is almost a topic we don't even consider anymore. Okay, the idea that anyone serious would go into the public arena, the public spaces, as you term it, and actually make an argument for social justice today. The community college was invented as an American invention of social justice. We were founded in 1924. Jackie Robinson is our alum. Okay, President Harbison, who was a Quaker, was the first college president in the country to invite back a Japanese student from the internment camp. And so it seems to me that one of the things that is contributing to this kind of heated argument is that, again, from the public perspective, it's like, well, social justice, well, we used to be able to afford that, but now we can't, so let's not talk about it, okay? Look, for example, okay, take it, the health care debate, okay, which was so heated, 3 years ago when President Obama and so on, and it created the Tea Party and so on. Is health care a human right or not? And it's like, it's unthinkable to, you're just going to have this argument over whether basic rights.
But see, that's a legitimate, I think that's
right.
A very legitimate argument to have. And much of the health care debate is really about that issue that doesn't get directly debated.
What the Academy is about is being able to provide an environment where that debate can go on. What kind of society do we want to have? And of course we're going to disagree about it. But education in this country was founded as a private institution. When Lauren talks about it, I'm very much aware of it. I've seen those students. We have students from PCC who go to Art Center, transfer to Art Center, and have that experience. But you're talking about a few students. And what we've always been able to do in this country is fight for the opportunity that every single one of us gets to have that experience. And that's what we're letting go of, and I think that's what's leading to some of the incivility. So one of the things, just to, instead of just ranting myself, one of the things I really think that we could do as presidents, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I mean, remember when college presidents had a voice and they actually talked and they weren't administrators and they were, they actually were leaders and they had a moral voice and they had a social voice and they actually talked about social. Now you're so afraid to say anything, and our discourse has devolved so much. So, I really do think that it's, we need to embark on a project. We know what works, forming community, engaging relationships, and so on. But really it's the function of leadership to create an environment where that kind of dialogue can happen. So.
All right. Anyone want to follow up on that? No. Let's talk about listening, because, stating the obvious to say that civility goes part and parcel with not listening to other people or giving them weight or considering that. What can we societally, higher education outside of that, do to encourage people to really listen, to be able to hear each other, and to give each other enough respect to be willing to, without stacking the deck, honestly respond?
Yeah, if I may comment, I'd like to go back to what Richard shared about family and the dinner table. I think, as you know, the fabrics of the family has changed drastically in this century and, of course, late 20th century. Now, having two-income families is very common, and they expect, the media to be the babysitter. And I have some statistics to share with you. Estimated number of TV homes, 150 million. Average time kids spend watching TV each day, about 4 hours. Children spend more time watching television than in any other activity except sleep. 54% of the kids have a TV in their bedroom. 44% of the kids say that they watch something different when they're alone than with their parents. And this goes on and on, and it was by the University of Kansas, a study was done. So we have basically now relinquished our responsibilities as parents, and have turned that over to the TV and, of course, the shows that we know. And I have a few statistics on that. 65% say that the shows like Simpsons and Married with Children encourage kids to respect their parents. And
disrespect, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
77% said there is too much. 66% of children aged 10 to 16 surveyed say that their peers are influenced by TV shows. So we have really become a kind of a nation of entertainment, as it was mentioned earlier. And if we don't do something about it, then of course it all starts at home, right, with the parents. But at the same time, we have tied the hands of the parents because most of them working, two parents working or single parents. And so we have to create some social safety nets that they can at least take advantage of being home on a certain time and have that dinner around the table and be able to have those kind of conversations. So those are the issues that I think needs to be discussed, and I personally don't think there's an immediate solution to it, but at least being aware of it will give us a chance to discuss it and have a dialogue and discourse about it.
And what you're saying about parents being absent, because part of that may be symptom as much as cause. When parents are gone, kids don't necessarily feel they need to answer to anyone, right? I mean, you're kind of like a free agent for many hours of the day. And I wonder if when we used to live in small towns, Stephen Koblik, as the historian, I'd be curious. My sense is people felt they had to answer to the community to a certain extent. I mean, you did something that was cruel or it's not just you as an island. Has that changed how we behave, a lack of connection in that way?
We've become more urbanized. So let's just start with the facts. So yes, small communities can be tough places to live too. But I don't want to romanticize them, depending on which small communities you're talking about under what circumstances. But certainly the small communities had capacity to do things if they wanted to. Most of them probably didn't, but if you wanted to do something, you could have a small community. I really do think that what we're looking at is a fundamental change in our society that's been ongoing. It's not new, but I do think the family, which has, we have a very unique country in the sense of our diversity. There's no other country like it in the world. California, 60% of the current adult population had at least one of their parents born outside the United States. So we are a diverse society. We also have the kinds of demands that Izzat was talking about in terms of two working people in the partnership that exists. And obviously that puts enormous pressure on both how a family works, but then how a society works. And I think we are in for a very long haul as we try to create new communities. We don't really have a choice. We're not going back to the past. We are going to create new communities. And I think you actually asked me the question about us living each in our own self-constructed cocoon. I didn't forget that. I just wanted to needle you on the other topic. But the fact of the matter is we have too many choices. I mean, that's what's really happened. We have way too many choices. No society ever created has had as many choices as contemporary societies, particularly in the Western democracies.
In what regard?
To almost anything. Because what's happened is that the new revolutions in technology have given us unbelievable choices. Well, just the regard of you sending your students overseas, that's a choice. Okay, we couldn't do that before. So the fact of the matter is that we have enormous amount of choices, and frankly, choices stokes fear because we're not really capable of making all those choices. I heard a presentation 2 weeks ago in Philadelphia of where there's going to be a new form of medicine, where doctors are no longer treating us, they're consulting with us. And frankly, that means I'm going to be my own doctor. I find that terrifying. And I don't want to be my own doctor. I want someone to tell me what's wrong with me and tell me what I should do. And I think that is generating an extraordinary amount of fear. And given the amount of choice we have in terms of information, yes, we tend to form communities, almost like families did before, where we share the same basic information. Because as we know, when we try to have dialogue with people who aren't in our communities, we discover they have very different meanings for the words. And I think that you pointed out one, when you start talking about social justice, of course we all think of ourselves as just human beings. So when those terminologies are used, they're keywords. And obviously the decision yesterday by the president to actually raise this issue of marriage to a national level, we are going to have a lot of conversations now in this election campaign about what marriage is and is not.
Yeah, and what rights mean, and how rights affect different groups. I also want to ask you, I mean, my sense is, and that's way oversimplification, but earlier in America, speaking of choice, there were pretty clearly defined roles that people had. And so you had to answer whether you were an outsider, misfit, you couldn't conform to that role, or you did conform to it and you knew you were on the inside and approved of. Now, there really isn't something to conform to in that way. So do you think that we as human beings, there's a disconnect with sort of how we want that certainty? We want to be told what to do. We, at a certain level, want everything to be prescribed, and we live in this world where that's impossible. Is that how you see it? Dr. Koplik?
I don't.
No, you don't? Jean-Luc Chamon?
In fact, I'm focusing on young people, and I have experience at Caltech, a relatively small number of students, but I have also, prior in my life, I worked at very large public universities, and I think young people don't want to fit a mold. They want to be their own person. They want to be challenged. We talk a lot about problems, but again, I want to come back. We are in position where we can do something about those things. Those young people want to be challenged. They want to do the kind of things you described. They want to work on, in our case, on research programs that excite them, that they believe could be important for medicine. And if we do those things, and by the way, if you keep them busy, they intend to forget a bit their TVs and things of the sort.
Your students have no time for that.
And then, okay, I think I agree with Steve. Always talking about the past doesn't help. The past is the past. The fact is now we have young people who are learning in different ways. They are multi-processing. They're doing parallel processing. I'm not always sure that they actually process everything they're trying to process, but that's the way it is, and we need to deal with it. And so I don't agree with you.
So you don't think they have the anxiety that older people do? You think they're adapting to the new world very well?
I think we should give them the credit. I'm sure they have anxieties, and they do have anxieties, but most of them are handling them, and they want to handle them their way, and likely will not be your way or my way. So.
Do you think they'll be more civil if, in fact, they're better adapted for this world?
Okay, now, and that's, I have agreed so far with 95% of what my good friend here said, with one exception. It's the one when the statement was made about, if I have the choice between learning and civility, I will choose learning. I think it is not a choice. I think in a university environment, you expect to have both. And I do expect that the young people coming out of those institutions are going to be great learners at the same time. will have learned skills which enable them to be civil, not only in their local environment, but wherever they will be in the future.
All right. Let me torment each of you at this point by asking each of you just in a minute, I mean, really keep it to a minute, if you were master of the universe and you could somehow, not just master of your institutions, if you could change the way we communicate with each other, what would you do institutionally, modeling other ways to make a more civil country? I'll begin with you, Dr. Rocha.
Thanks, Larry. Well, the first thing I do is have them listen to your show more often. I have to confess, in a guilty pleasure that, the buttons on my radio, and I have a car so old that I still have buttons on it. I've got KPCC, of course, but then sometimes you're kind of like too civil, and then I go right over to talk radio because I want to hear some arguing. What could I do? First thing that I would do is, I agree with Dr. Mao that to make progress on civility requires a great deal of humility, especially those who are privileged to be leaders. And so we really do have to lower ourselves and be quiet and listening, so those are just kind of personal ethics. The larger thing is that I do think I'd ask, and our faculty are working on it, I'd ask our faculty to work on building what we call learning communities, and what is it that they think our students should know. We're concerned, for example, it really is hard. If you go through a college education, you learn something about art and literature. So those are a couple things.
All right, very good. Dr. Parnia.
Yes. I would require everybody to attend Pacific Oaks College and Children's School.
And your enrollment is growing, right? So you could take more.
I will enroll everyone, and I will invite Dr. Shamu to join us in one of our potlucks because we don't have a Marriott serving our students. Our students bring their own food at around 5:30, 5:45, and they have a nice meal, and then they go to class. But kidding aside, I think we'll start with Washington, D.C. I really think that leaders play a very important role in terms of set the agenda for the rest of us, in terms of how we behave. And as long as this kind of situation is in Washington developing, that every day we see they're fighting one another and disrespect that they extend to one another. And it's just given a very bad impression, to the rest of us, and especially to the kids, because I think really we serve as role models, as parents, as leaders, and of course they always look up to politicians, from the president to congressmen and senators and all that. So in fact, I have an 8-year-old daughter, and she came to home one day and she told me about learning about the presidents, and she knows about George Washington, and she knows about Lincoln and President Obama. And I'm sure when somebody insults President Obama, for an 8-year-old, that really has a completely different connotation than anything else. So, and it's not just President Obama, I'm talking about any, because when you insult the president, you're insulting the presidency, and that carries a lot of weight in this country. So this is not about individuals, and we have to understand that. When you insult the office, you are basically sending a very wrong message to the rest of us, and that's not right.
All right, Dr. Koblik.
I tried to explain to my staff that they shouldn't insult the president, but that hasn't been terribly effective. But I'd rather answer this on a personal level, and that is, I think we've already heard from Rich and from actually everyone on the panel. You as an individual, you can model yourself, and you can be patient, and you can be calm, and you can be a good listener. I'm a very political animal all my life, and it's become apparent that we need to have discourse. And so I've taken a lot of time in the last few years to try to structure discourse, whether it's with someone I'm standing in line to buy something with, or whether I'm in the parking lot and I've gotten angry and so forth, to just structure discourse and to try to have conversations, particularly with people who are coming from different places. Because I think in doing that, we have to reconstruct our community. You may have heard, it may have been announced, we have a new director of the Smithsonian American History Institute. I'm not sure that they announced that yet.
They have. In fact, John was on my show yesterday morning.
There you go. So John Gray is the new head, and we had talked about this during this search process. And I said the problem is we've lost an integrated story of the community. We don't have a history of the United States. So we're going to have to recreate it. I think that's a good project, and I know a lot of voices will be involved in it.
All right, very good, Dr. Coblin. Dr. Shammo?
Since I knew that my friend would say something profound, I have something very practical. I would. You said there is no limit. I am in charge.
You are in charge, right?
I would have every graduate of every university and high school or high schools, if they don't graduate from a university, to spend a year traveling in a country and over the world, 1 year before they enter the workforce, and learn about other communities and learn to be civil. That's one thing. The other thing I would do would be to, in coming back to something that Steve said earlier in his remark, I would reinstate the duo as being something legal, because it did serve a very good purpose. When people like, since Steve and you clearly disagree and we will not get along, you would solve it. You would go outside at the end of the show and take care of it. So.
But he'd have a huge advantage with any historic weapon, so I'd be out of luck. Dr. Buckman.
Well, master the universe and ensuring that we address this issue, I would say we make sure that we honor the creative imagination. Let's make sure that we fight this very distasteful way of banning art and creativity from our schools. Art and creativity gives a way for people to express, to find ways of entering into dialogue, to developing compassion, to being able to lead themselves in a way that is responsible and honors, again, the imagination and human expression. You know, in thinking about today, for some reason I went back to a great artistic event in the history of Western culture, which was a play written by Aeschylus and was performed. It's called The Persians. And what was extraordinary about that play is that the collective came together, the whole culture came together, and that play was about the Persian War, the Greco-Persian War, but it was from the perspective of the Persian community. It was from the perspective of those that were destroyed in war by the Greeks to a Greek audience. That artist, that playwright, that Aeschylus, wrote in a way that allowed for compassion to surface, for a community to stop for a moment with their own particular biased point of view and understand that in every act there is another human being on the other side, that we can hear it, that we can listen, and that if Freud is right, that fundamentally we are just pleasure-seeking and ultimately violent and civilization is what keeps us going, then art becomes a way for us to develop compassion, to build it, and to understand that we can structure things in a way that allows us to understand that an other has a different point of view and give difference a dignity.
Wow. We have just a little bit more of the program, but I want to encourage you to stay afterwards, because instead of doing formal questions and answers, be sticking around a little bit afterwards. If you want to talk with any of the panelists, share some of your ideas or ask them questions, please feel free to do that afterwards. But we conclude Dr. Mao coming back up to respond to what he's heard in response to his keynote. Dr. Mao?
Well, I won't take long, but I want to say this has been a wonderful discussion, and I've learned a lot from my presidential colleagues here today, and the mayor and I were commenting on the passionate body language here, and I want to say I think this is very encouraging for the kind of leadership that we need from people in higher education, so thank you. Steve, I stand corrected on a lot of the historical data that you raised, but it was interesting that he talked about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. He was looking, there have been these ones. You know, I'm a Calvinist. I'm not saying things are getting better or worse. We've always been sinners and all the rest. But but there have been moments in the past, and I think of Lincoln, for example, and how after the war between the states, when he could have boasted of a great victory, and instead called people to forgive, want people to cultivate a spirit of humility. That's the kind of leadership in public life that promotes civility that I think we sadly miss today. And I think the big question, what kind of society Mark raised this? What kind of society do we want to promote? What kind of people do we want to be? And I still think that in every one of most of your schools, if you take Pasadena City College, if that arrogant young man who listens to Rush Limbaugh and just says, why don't they just go back where they came from, could meet the sophomore at Pasadena City College who was brought over the border at 2 months old by parents who did not have the proper credentials, and who's basically never been back. And this is her culture, and all she wants to do is to teach in the school, the kind of school where she had teachers who encouraged her along the way. And to be able to look her in the eye and say, why don't you go back where you came from? That's precisely lacking what Lauren talked about, those wonderful terms, compassion, empathy, having that in-feeling, being able to imagine what it's like to be her, and then what it's like to have somebody say to you, go back where you came from, and the cruelty of that, the insensitivity of that, so that the immigration debate really has to be real people talking to each other. And I think we do have an obligation as educators to promote that kind of that kind of dialogue, that kind of, and so we really need to ask, how are we going to do that? I think one of the great, and no one really raised this, but one of the great obstacles these days is the highly specialized nature of academic research and academic study. And I'm not going to complain about that. I think we've learned a lot from that. But for many of us in our younger years, we were inspired by people who had a big vision, teachers who, and these days with specialization, we often don't have that. And I think as presidents, we have an obligation to find ways to do that. It may not be in the classroom. It may be in other sorts of ways. But we're talking about campus communities and not just classrooms. And I think we can do a lot. And the humility, really listening, the empathy. I was raised in New Jersey, and as a little kid, I was an avid Brooklyn Dodgers fan. I've never actually forgiven them for moving out here, but and I was such a Brooklyn Dodgers fan that when Jackie Robinson came on the scene, I wanted him to succeed. And I can remember as a kid in a basically racist subculture, really feeling sorry for Jackie Robinson, really rejoicing when he stole home base in a World Series game. I mean, and to me, that was one of my first lessons in racism, in countering racism. And it wasn't just listening to speeches, and it wasn't reading books, but it was the experience of trying to put myself in somebody else's shoes, and it was a wonderful opportunity to be able to do that in terms of being a baseball fan. But we can create opportunities like that where we really listen to each other. And so I want to say I think this is a wonderful conversation. I'm encouraged. Some of my heroes as presidents, Father Ted Hesburgh and Clark Kerr and people like that. I think we need to read their stories and learn more from them. And I'm very encouraged about what I hear. And I would say, let's have a meal together sometime. Thanks.
Before we conclude, again, just feel free to stay to talk with members of the panel, who are able to stay. And let me say to all of you that I just am very honored. The things that you said, speaking from the heart, the passion you feel for education, for our society, for the culture, whether it's art, science, history, teaching education, whether it's the full scope of curricula that you see at PCC. You clearly love what you do, you love your students, and you really want to see them make a difference. What is better than that? I thank you, and we are so lucky in this community to have you all. You're real local treasures. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was terrific.
Absolutely, I will definitely make that.
About the Persians, just beautiful. Thank you.
Good job. Yep. Fine.